Hi again, everybody. Today we're going to continue our conversation of the American Gothic. Um, in particular, we're going to focus on the readings Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, and then also we'll talk about Robert Martin's essay as well as the Wieder essay from the American Gothic collection. So, to begin, let's start off with the importance of regionalism in any study of the Gothic. Last time we spoke very broadly about an American Gothic and how the Gothic really is embedded in our understanding of what it means to be American, and our understanding of the totality that is the New World at the time. But this lecture is going to move us a little bit more specifically into the regional Gothics that took shape, especially in the 19th century. And there are two that we are going to focus on: Puritanical Gothic, or the New England Gothic, and Southern Gothic. And these really also fall along two particular timelines. The New England Gothic really is in the early half of the 19th century, whereas the Southern Gothic comes after the Civil War, during the time of Reconstruction. So those are two particular time periods. Now, that's not to say that they end by the end of the 19th century. I mean, clearly, Faulkner's writing in the early 20th century, and people like Lovecraft, who we will discuss next time, could easily be classified in the school of the kind of New England Gothic. But for our sake here, I want to talk I want to compartmentalize them as the first half of the 19th, and then after the Civil War. So, let's begin with Hawthorne's famous story, Young Goodman Brown, probably his most well-known short story. And you can tell immediately that it has a kind of puritanical basis. It's focusing on Hawthorne's Puritan ancestry. Of course, when Hawthorne's writing in the early to mid 19th century, he is some degrees removed from the kind of stereotypical vision of the Puritans in America. Think of Salem and the witch trials, and actually, interestingly enough, Hawthorne's great-great-grandfather was a judge, and a very harsh judge during the time of the Salem witch trials. So a big part of this is a big part of this story is coming to terms with his own past. Hawthorne would change his name and add a W. His ancestors, up until Nathaniel, there was no W in the name. He inserts the W to really distinguish himself from his forefathers, to drive a kind of wedge, to repress his own personal and family history. So, that's an important point, because obviously when young Goodman Brown goes out into the forest on his kind of ill-fated journey into the Massachusetts wilderness, he's going to run into Goodman Brown, the later version of himself, who has become some kind of distorted, evil version of the hopeful young man. He's got his snakehead staff that he's walking around with. So, obviously, there's a tone here of coming to terms with your father, with your forefathers. In fact, in the final moments of the story, when there's the kind of blaze and they're summoning forward the quote-unquote converts, he sees his father beckoning him forward. So it is quite literally his forefathers that are part of this evil, shadowy forest that he has wandered into. mise en scène, the kind of atmospheric, so the setting of the New England Gothic. Not surprisingly, given the landscape of New England, it is usually the forests surrounding villages. Um, these forests are full of mystery and intrigue, as this is no example of it. Perhaps the best way, or the best moment that is embodying this phenomenon is when they go into when he kind of lets it all go and runs madly into the forest, plunging ahead into the darkness, and he at that time hears all of this din in the forest. He hears Indian shrieks intermingled with the pealing of church bells in the distance, and this kind of madness sets in the forest. So, the setting is often plays a pivotal role here, and the New England landscape, the stuff of Puritan nightmare, is the woods, because it, again, and this goes back to our last conversation, the woods represents everything that is unknown. You can imagine perhaps yourself as a colonial figure. You live in the kind of outskirts of this settlement. Beyond this line of the forest is a place you can't even imagine. It is an abyss, somewhat like the sea for Melville. For Hawthorne, it represents everything outside of civilization. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that the Native Americans uh, find themselves an active stock character in the puritanical New England Gothic. So it's a very distinctive mise en scène, and one that Hawthorne will return to time and time again. And playing in that is the sins of the father, uh, involving the burning of Indian villages and the lashing of Quaker women. Um, the people that young Goodman Brown runs into on his way to the kind of demonic meeting at the center of the forest, these are all supposedly respectable figures, but a part of their past that they cannot keep down or keep hidden are these horrific deeds, such as the public lashing of the Quaker and the burning down of this village. And these things really demonstrate the hypocrisy at the heart of Hawthorne's message here. The heart of his tale is one of surfaces polished that cannot hide the kind of ugly underside of the American project at this time. The people who have been harmed and tortured and killed and cast aside. And so these well-to-do figures in society, including clergymen, are revealed to be actually far from the kind of holier-than-thou persona that they have adopted. And this really establishes, too, the relationship to the past that is so pivotal for Hawthorne. Hawthorne's characters, including young Goodman Brown, must come to terms with their past transgressions in particular. And so young Goodman Brown is facing all of these horrifying nightmares tucked into his own name, into his own family past. And he has to come to terms with this. He has to learn to do something with this sense of guilt that he feels about his family history. Ultimately, the solution to the problem, he loses sight of Faith, and that is the name of his wife. Again, this is very allegorical. It's clear that Faith is standing in for something, a larger concept. And he doesn't really have to stretch very far. He calls Faith his aptly named wife. So he's trying to hold on desperately to his faith, and at the end of the story, he admits, "My faith is gone." When he sees the pink ribbon, he says, "My faith is gone," and he sees her around the area of the converts and simply believes that he can't even hold on to his faith, that faith itself is corrupt. And so we're left in the end with an old Goodman Brown who is gloomy, who can't, who sees everybody as being hiding something within his midst, or in society's midst, and he really wants to face this, but he has no hold over his faith anymore. His faith is not there. He can't even have that, and so we leave the character in a state of utter gloom and destitution. The story then serves a didactic purpose, and this is something that is of note when you're discussing Hawthorne. Hawthorne himself, as a man, was particularly disciplined. He believed that he and his family should be held to extremely high standards, and so these questions, he really saw a moral imperative when writing much of his fiction. Here in Young Goodman Brown, so it serves a kind of didactic function of teaching the reader that faith must be held on to, even in the face of these kinds of dark questions, and if not, you must live in this kind of puritanical misery. So it poses some very serious questions and some very serious accusations against those who pretend to be pious, this false piety, and who commit serious atrocities in the shadow of night. So that is Hawthorne's lesson for us in the story. Now, I want to move from there to the Martin essay. I signed the Martin essay because I think it helps us in some way to distinguish Hawthorne from Faulkner and distinguish the New England Gothic from the Southern Gothic. Martin really wants to talk about how for Hawthorne, his Gothic leans ultimately towards the Romantic. That is, it poses a kind of Gothic past to haunt the characters, but ultimately there's a kind of resolution, there's a lesson learned. He uses House of the Seven Gables as his example. A marriage at the end resolves the conflict, and the characters are allowed to come to terms with their own past, to kind of soothe these haunting figures. And so that's a kind of particular relationship that Hawthorne builds to personal and societal history, that it will return from its repression, but we must ultimately come to terms with it and resolve it and, so to speak, exorcise the demons. Now, that's Martin's argument about how history and inheritance plays a role in Hawthorne. He's going to go on to say, though, Faulkner does something quite different. William Faulkner is going to, he doesn't see history as being something that can be resolved, that the issue of inheritance is one that is permanent and the past is always with us. It eats away at the foundation of our being, both our personal and, again, our societal being. There's a decay, that the past is rotting, stinking, it's a corpse that simply can't simply be cast aside. So, historically speaking, with William Faulkner, he is interested in the Reconstruction era, the South that comes after the Civil War. For those of you who know anything about post-Civil War history in the United States, especially in the South, Southern states suffer a lot of destitution and poverty, and in a lot of ways society is kind of undercut. The rotten core of slavery has fully exposed itself, and the Southern gentry or the Southern aristocrats are left to face the legacy that came before them. What are they going to do with all of the monsters and phantoms that were born of the institution of slavery? all of these large plantation houses. This is the mise en scène, the setting that Faulkner's going to use. These enormous plantation houses with their kind of regal exterior. And many of his stories are going to deal with these places as haunted houses that are actually crypts. There are undesirable, putrefied corpses and secrets at the heart of these plantation homes that cannot be cast aside. The past is constantly there. It saturates the southern landscape, and this is something that's going to define the Southern Gothic, is this sense of decay and this sense of ubiquitous haunting. The entire southern landscape is really saturated with an evil or disturbing past. Like Hawthorne, Faulkner's haunted landscape is going to include many slaves in place of the Indian. In both cases, both for the New England Gothic and the Southern Gothic, there is a kind of racial other. There's a group that is there to remind the white protagonist of their sinful deeds in the past. In one, it's the extermination of Native Americans. In the other, it is, of course, the larger issue of enslavement. So I want to look at some of the wording in A Rose for Emily. I'm talking about the house that is a fallen monument, quote unquote. Lettering that is written as thin, flowing calligraphy in faded ink. And then finally, I think the most tangible aspect of this story is the smell, and Faulkner talks a lot about the stench of this rotting, aristocratic character. Dust and disuse, a close, dank smell. So we are literally experiencing the Southern Gothic as something that is rotten and disused and dank. The smell says so much about this haunted place that is Emily's old home. So, ultimately, you have Homer Barron come in, a Yankee, who's going to come into the South and make a fortune. Again, getting back to the issue of Reconstruction, you have Northerners coming in to try and exploit or make profit in these southern regions. Ultimately, we know what happens to Homer quite graphically at the end. We see his fate. So as opposed to Hawthorne, who is going to see the past as something to be dealt with, to come to terms with, to learn a lesson from, for Faulkner, the past is something that clings to the present like some kind of Spanish moss or something like this. It is a virus or a bacteria that just kind of won't let go of the present. It's not something that can easily be exterminated. So Faulkner sets up two visions of the kind of southern past. In one hand, you have this is a quote, a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches. That is the romantic idea of the southern antebellum period, the period of southern wealth and prosperity. Oppositionally now, Emily's home has become quite literally a tomb. It is a place where the vengeful South stews and clings onto the North as if to destroy them both. And so this idea of the South that is secretly plotting to latch onto the North and bring them both down in a kind of devastating tragedy. That is the kind of that's the difference really between a New England and a Southern Gothic. In the Southern Gothic, there's this hopelessness. There's this sense that the North and South are entwined in some kind of incestuous or disturbing or uncanny relationship to one another, and that the Civil War will continue to plague and haunt this country for many, many years to come. The sins of slavery and the kind of death and blood and all of these unpleasant things that are waiting in the basement of the aristocratic homes. So that's the kind of distinction between the two, both fascinating in their own regard, but both tell us something quite distinct about how Gothics developed in different regions of the United States. All right, finally, I want to end with an open question or a contemplation of sorts. What are we supposed to do with Emily, the bloated, this is a quote, the bloated like a body long submerged in motionless water? What are we supposed to do with this corpse-like character? What are we supposed to do with the gloom of the puritanical young Goodman Brown who can no longer have faith in anything, or who can't come to terms with the hypocrisy of the people in his society? What are we supposed to do with all of these horrors, the extermination of Native Americans, the maltreatment of slaves? What are we supposed to do with these national tragedies, these national horror stories? What's left to be done with them? The Wieder essay is kind of interesting in that on one side it seems to take a Hawthorne-like position, saying that we expose these horrors, these wounds, so that we can heal them. That's a very Hawthorne-like position. The wounds are exposed, the past is exposed, so that we can then collectively and individually heal those wounds and come to some kind of consensus. And this is Vider's real staunch belief in this essay, that there's something that in the Gothic that helps us to advance a more just, equal, horror-free society. So the Gothic plays a certain cathartic role, and it helps us to move forward and make progress as a people. That perhaps all these Gothic stories about Native Americans and slaves and the Southern gentry and the repressed Puritans, these stories will help us to become better, to become stronger, more spiritually well-developed people. So the Gothic plays a certain function in that way. That's a very Hawthorne-like perspective. But on the other hand, we can't forget Faulkner's contribution in his very memorable story. That sense that perhaps things are hopeless, that you cannot get rid of the unsavory, nightmarish past. It holds on to you. It cannot be removed. That sense of hopelessness or dread is really part of the Southern Gothic, and also then it will go on to influence much of 20th century Gothic. So I want us to keep that in mind as we move into Lovecraft as well as the rest of the 20th century. Lovecraft is going to have his own set of questions that are deeply connected to this. That is the Gothic something which helps us to heal, or is the Gothic something that simply cuts us down and says there's no possible healing to be had? Is it a hopeful or pessimistic genre? And so as we move forward from the Poes and the Hawthornes and the Faulkners into the 20th century, I think we need to keep that in the back of our mind. What is the legacy of the American Gothic? One of hope or one of hopelessness? it's still a question that is worth pondering over. Alright, so I hope you will ponder it over. Use the discussion forum as a place to explore these stories more, maybe discuss Welty's stories and kind of see if you can connect them together. And let's start addressing some of these questions as a group. Alright, I will talk to you next time.